The halls of Casterly Rock were never silent. Even in the dead of night, the waves crashed against the cliffs below, an eternal reminder of the kingdom's might. Yet within the grand castle, a storm of another kind raged, one that threatened to change everything. Johanna Lannister, Lady of Casterly Rock, lay in her birthing chamber, her golden hair drenched in sweat as she fought through the pain. Tywin Lannister stood by her side, his usual stoic mask cracking as he watched his beloved wife struggle. The maesters had warned him before. This child might take Johanna's life. But Johanna had never been one to surrender. When the cries of the newborn filled the chamber, the room fell silent, waiting. Johanna was pale but breathing. The masters hesitated before announcing what no one had expected. She had survived. Tywin, usually unreadable, exhaled sharply and gripped Johanna's hand. She, exhausted but victorious, gazed at her son with weary pride. Tyrion Lannister was born, and for the first time in many years, there was something like joy in Casterly Rock. The years passed and Johanna remained a force in her children's lives. Where Tywin was strict, Johanna was calculating, knowing when to push and when to pull back. She saw the fire in Jaime's spirit, the ambition in Cersei, and the keen mind hidden beneath Tyrion's small frame. She would not allow them to be broken by the weight of their name. Jaime still trained with the sword, still yearned to be a knight, but his mother whispered wisdom to him that Tywin never would. Strength is not just in the hand that holds the sword, my son. It is in the mind that wields it. Cersei, beautiful and cunning, still dreamt of power, but Johanna guided her ambition. A queen's power is not only in her beauty or her crown, she told her daughter, brushing golden curls from her face. It is in knowing which battles to fight and which to let others fight for you. And Tyrion was never alone. Johanna saw the intelligence in him that Tywin refused to acknowledge. You are my son, she told him, holding his small hands in hers, and you will never be less than that. With Johanna alive, the Lannister children grew differently. Tywin still held power, but his wife was a force to be reckoned with. And as the years passed, her survival began to change, not just the future of her children, but of Westeros itself. As Tyrion grew, so did his mind. Johanna ensured he was given the best tutors, pushing back against Tywin's dismissal of their youngest son. She knew her husband would never truly accept Tyrion, but she also knew something Tywin did not. Tyrion's mind was sharper than any Lannister sword. The boy devoured books, learning of politics, war, and history with an insatiable hunger. He listened in on his father's meetings, absorbing the way power shifted with words rather than steel. Johanna, though subtle, guided him. You must understand, my son, she whispered to Tyrion one evening as they sat in the library. Our house stands not because we are strong, but because we are clever. Your father is feared, but true power lies in knowing what others desire before they do. Tyrion grinned, flipping a page in his book. Then I shall be the most powerful of all. Johanna smiled, but worry still lingered in her heart. She could protect Tyrion from his father's wrath for now, but Tywin was not a man easily swayed. Jaime Lannister was the son Tywin had placed all his hopes upon. The golden heir, the one meant to lead House Lannister into greater glory. But with Johanna still alive, Jaime's path was no longer dictated solely by his father. You will not join the King's Guard, she told him one evening, her voice calm but firm. Your father would see you waste your future at Aerys' side, but I will not. Jaime hesitated. But if I refuse, father— Let me deal with your father, Johanna interrupted. You must think beyond the oaths of a knight. You are a Lannister first. Do you understand? Jaime did. It was Johanna's guidance that changed Jaime's fate. Instead of taking the White Cloak, he remained at Casterly Rock, training not just in combat, but in leadership. He became more than just a warrior. He became a lord in the making, learning the art of ruling, of commanding, of knowing when to act and when to wait. And so, the Lannister heir remained where he was needed most. Cersei, the daughter who burned with the desire for power, watched her mother carefully. She still longed to be queen, but she learned something even more valuable from Johanna: how to wield influence without making enemies. You will have power, Johanna told her, but you must understand that a queen rules not through fear alone, but through alliances. You cannot afford to be reckless. Cersei listened. She still desired Prince Rhaegar, but Johanna had no illusions about the Targaryen prince's intentions. Rhaegar will never choose you, she told Cersei bluntly. His heart belongs elsewhere, but there are other ways to shape your destiny. Instead of waiting for a doomed marriage to Rhaegar, Johanna worked behind the scenes, negotiating a different match, one that would still place Cersei in a powerful position. With Johanna's presence, the course of Westeros was shifting. Jaime did not take the white cloak. Instead, he remained a Lannister heir, learning the art of ruling. Tyrion was not dismissed but nurtured, growing into a political mind that could one day challenge even Tywin. Cersei was not blinded by reckless ambition, but taught how to wield true influence. And in the shadows, Johanna Lannister watched, knowing that the game was only just beginning. As Johanna solidified her influence within Casterly Rock, the rest of Westeros continued on its course. King Aerys II, once a promising ruler, grew more erratic and unstable. Whispers of his madness spread like wildfire. But for the Lannisters, the real concern was power. Who held it, who wanted it, and who could take it? Johanna knew that the Targaryens were unraveling, and she knew that Tywin, despite his outward loyalty, resented being passed over as Rhaegar's father-in-law. But rather than let her husband stew in his wounded pride, she sought to redirect his ambitions. It was during a quiet evening in their chambers that she spoke. "You should look north," she told Tywin, sipping from her goblet of wine. Her husband scoffed. "The north? What use do we have for wolves?" Johanna set her goblet down. "You want an alliance that will not betray us? One that will stand when the Targaryens inevitably fall? Look to Winterfell." Tywin frowned but listened. "A betrothal," she continued. "Jaime to one of Lord Rickard Stark's daughters. A southern alliance for them and for us. A house that values honor over ambition. They would never seek to overthrow us as the Tyrells or Martells might." Tywin was silent, considering. It was a rare moment when he was not the one dictating the course of their house's future. And so, under Johanna's careful hand, the wheels were set in motion. The raven was sent, and after much negotiation, an arrangement was made. Jaime Lannister was to be betrothed to Lyanna Stark's younger sister, Sarah Stark. Unlike the doomed betrothal of Lyanna and Robert Baratheon, this union had time to grow. Jaime, no longer shackled to the Kingsguard, had a future. And though he and Sarah were still young, their engagement planted the seeds of something Westeros had never seen before, a genuine alliance between lions and wolves. Sarah Stark was not Lyanna. She was gentler, more reserved, but fiercely intelligent. And to Johanna's delight, she had no interest in bending to Tywin's will. The girl was strong in ways that Cersei was not. Her strength came from patience, from knowing when to strike and when to wait. Jaime, who had spent his youth chasing glory, found himself drawn to her quiet wisdom. And for the first time in his life, he began to imagine a future beyond war and bloodshed. As House Lannister strengthened its ties, King Aerys II continued to spiral. His paranoia deepened, his cruelty grew unchecked, and soon it was clear. War was inevitable. When Prince Rhaegar abducted Lyanna Stark, the North erupted. Robert Baratheon called for war, and House Stark was dragged into the rebellion that would shape Westeros forever. Tywin, ever the strategist, remained on the sidelines, waiting. But it was Johanna who understood that this was the moment to act. She urged caution, but she also urged preparation. "If we do not choose the winning side, our children will pay the price," she warned. "Rhaegar is no fool, but Aerys is a madman. He will destroy us all before he cedes power." Still, Tywin waited, and while he waited, the war consumed the realm. Only when it was clear that Robert's forces would win did Tywin finally move. But unlike in the original timeline, Jaime was not a Kingsguard. He was with the Lannister forces, leading men in battle. And as the city burned, it was not Jaime who killed Aerys. It was Johanna's doing. She had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, speaking to the right people, making the right promises. When the Lannisters finally entered King's Landing, she had already ensured that Aerys would not survive the night. Instead of Jaime striking down the Mad King, it was one of Tywin's own men, a trusted bannerman whose loyalty had been secured by Johanna herself. And with Aerys' death, the stain of Kingslayer, never touched Jaime's name. The war ended, Robert Baratheon took the throne, and House Lannister stood stronger than ever. With Jaime's reputation intact, with Cersei learning patience instead of reckless ambition, and with Tyrion valued for his mind rather than cast aside, House Lannister was no longer a family fractured by internal strife. Johanna Lannister had ensured that. She had outmaneuvered Tywin in the one way that mattered most, securing the future. And as Westeros adjusted to the new rule of King Robert, one truth became clear. The Lannisters had won the game before it even began. With King Aerys dead and Robert Baratheon seated on the Iron Throne, Westeros entered a new era. The realm was still licking its wounds from the war, but House Lannister stood tall, stronger than ever. Unlike in the original timeline, Jaime Lannister was not disgraced as the Kingslayer. Instead, he was hailed as a war hero, a commander who had led Lannister forces in securing the capital. His name remained untarnished, his reputation intact, and with no dishonor upon him, his betrothal to Sarah Stark held firm. Cersei, meanwhile, did not become Robert Baratheon's queen. Johanna had been firm on that matter. A drunken, unfaithful man will bring you nothing but misery, she had warned her daughter. Instead, she had maneuvered a different match, one that secured power without placing her daughter in a position of humiliation. Tyrion, no longer the outcast, was slowly carving his own path, though Tywin still struggled to see his worth. But with his mother as his shield, Tyrion had one thing he never had in the original timeline: time. Time to grow, time to learn, time to become the force that would one day change Westeros. With Cersei no longer bound to Robert, Johanna turned her eyes to a more suitable match. After long discussions, it was settled: Cersei would marry Stannis Baratheon. It was not a love match, nor was it an easy one. Stannis was cold, rigid, and humorless. Cersei was vain, ambitious, and fiery. They clashed often, and yet, under Johanna's guidance, Cersei learned to play the role of a political wife rather than a reckless queen. She bore Stannis children, though their marriage was never affectionate. But unlike in another world where she descended into bitterness and paranoia, this Cersei learned restraint. She learned that true power was not in destruction, but in patience. And as the years passed, she became the quiet force behind Stannis' ambitions. Tyrion's path was never easy, not even with his mother's protection. Tywin still refused to see him as a true Lannister. But Johanna was relentless in ensuring her youngest son was given every opportunity. He was not sent to be a mere steward. Instead, Johanna arranged for him to serve under Lord Jon Arryn in the Vale, learning the art of governance from one of the most respected lords in the realm. And so, while his father ignored him, Tyrion sharpened his mind, learning from those who shaped the kingdom. Years later, when Jon Arryn eventually passed, it was Tyrion, not Petyr Baelish, who was called upon to advise the king. And thus the game shifted yet again. In another timeline, Petyr Baelish thrived in the chaos, manipulating lords and kings alike. But in this world, where Tyrion had risen as a trusted advisor, Littlefinger's schemes were met with quiet resistance. Tyrion was no fool. He saw through Baelish's lies, his ambitions, his dangerous whispers. And when the time came, he struck first. By exposing Littlefinger's past deceptions, his financial manipulations, his secret alliances, Tyrion ensured that Baelish was cast out before he could weave his web of chaos. Without Baelish, Ned Stark's fate was not sealed by treachery. Without Baelish, the War of the Five Kings never began. And without Baelish, Westeros remained precariously balanced, but balanced nonetheless. Robert Baratheon still grew fat and careless. His love for drinking and whoring remained unchanged, but without Cersei's bitter hatred and Baelish's manipulations, his downfall was not so immediate. When his death finally came, through age, not assassination, the question of succession arose. Stannis Baratheon, cold and unwavering, had the strongest claim. But he also had something else: a Lannister wife and Lannister children. And so, when the realm looked for a new king, it found one who was not just a Baratheon, but also a Lannister by marriage. The Iron Throne belonged to the Baratheons in name, but in truth, it was the Lannisters who had won. It had been Johanna's survival that changed everything. It had been her wisdom that kept Jaime from disgrace, that shaped Cersei into something greater than a bitter queen, that guided Tyrion onto the path of power. It had been her influence that ensured House Lannister stood not as a family divided by treachery, but as the architects of the realm's future. And as she sat in Casterly Rock, watching the game she had played so masterfully unfold, Johanna Lannister allowed herself a rare smile. The Lions had won, and the world would never be the same. With Robert Baratheon dead and Stannis ascending to the Iron Throne, Westeros entered an era of newfound stability. Unlike his older brother, Stannis was not a man given to excess. He was a ruler of discipline, law, and unwavering principles, perhaps too rigid for the ever-changing politics of the realm. But where Stannis lacked in flexibility, Cersei Lannister provided what was necessary. She had learned well from her mother. Gone was the impulsive, reckless girl who once believed she was destined for Rhaegar Targaryen. In her place stood a woman of patience, cunning, and a carefully controlled fire. And she knew what others did not. Stannis needed her. Unlike in another world where Cersei's ambition burned unchecked, this version of her had been molded into something far more dangerous. A woman who knew how to wield power not through force, but through influence. Where Stannis was severe, she was charming. Where Stannis was unyielding, she was adaptable. And so, while the realm whispered that Stannis Baratheon sat the throne, those who truly understood the game of power knew the truth. The Lannisters ruled Westeros. Back at Casterly Rock, Jaime Lannister had become what Tywin always wanted him to be, a ruler, not just a warrior. With no disgrace of kingslaying attached to his name, he had risen as a respected commander and leader, a man shaped by war, but not consumed by it. He had taken Sarah Stark as his wife, forging an alliance that bound the Lannisters and Starks together in ways previously thought impossible. Under his leadership, the Westerlands flourished. Trade expanded. The gold mines of Casterly Rock were richer than ever. And unlike in another world, where the Lannisters were seen as treacherous opportunists, House Lannister was now regarded as the foundation of the realm. Jaime no longer sought glory on the battlefield. He had learned from his mother that true power was in legacy. And as he held his newborn son, his heir, the future Lord of Casterly Rock, he understood for the first time what his mother had always known. Power was not just in the sword, it was in the bloodline that endured. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister had achieved what no one had ever thought possible. He had become the most powerful man in the realm. After years of serving under Jon Arryn and proving himself as a brilliant political mind, he had been named Hand of the King by Stannis himself. It was a move that shocked many, but those who had watched Tyrion's rise understood. He was not just a Lannister, he was a man of strategy, a master of words, and a ruler who understood that power was not in force alone, but in knowing when to wield it. Unlike his father, who had ruled through fear, Tyrion ruled through intelligence. He outmaneuvered his enemies not by crushing them, but by making them believe they had won. Under his guidance, the crown's debts were lowered, the nobility were kept in check, and the small folk, for the first time in generations, felt the presence of a ruler who truly understood them. And though Tywin Lannister had never seen him as his true heir, the rest of Westeros had. For Tyrion Lannister had become what his father could never be, a kingmaker. With no red wedding, no betrayal at the twins, and no War of the Five Kings, House Stark remained strong in the north. Eddard Stark, though wary of the new order in Westeros, found himself bound by ties he could not ignore. His youngest daughter, Sarah, was now Lady of Casterly Rock. His old friend Robert was gone, and in his place sat Stannis, stern but just. And Tyrion, to Ned's surprise, was a ruler he could respect. Though there was no love between House Stark and House Lannister, there was something far more important. Peace. Not to Stannis, who was too old and unyielding, not to Jaime, who was already bound to the Stark girl, but to Stannis' eldest son, a boy with Baratheon blood, a bridge between past and future, and Daenerys, though reluctant, accepted. With Daenerys bound to Westeros through marriage, her claim was no longer contested by fire and blood. Her dragons, instead of burning cities, became a symbol of unity. The Targaryens did not return as conquerors. They returned as rulers. And the Lannisters? They remained what they had always been, the architects of the realm, the unseen hand that guided the throne. Johanna Lannister, on her deathbed years later, smiled as she listened to the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs of Casterly Rock. She had won, not through war, not through bloodshed, but through the careful, patient game of power. And as she closed her eyes for the last time, she knew one thing with certainty. The lions had ruled, and they always would. Johanna Lannister's death was met with mourning throughout the Westerlands. Though she had never worn a crown, she had shaped the fate of Westeros more than any ruler ever had. Her funeral was held in the grand halls of Casterly Rock, where lords and ladies from all corners of the realm gathered to pay their respects. Jaime Lannister stood at the head of the gathering, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He was no longer the reckless young knight who had once dreamed only of glory. He was now Lord of Casterly Rock, a ruler in his own right. Beside him stood Sarah Stark, his wife, who had brought the North and the West together in ways no one had imagined. Tyrion Lannister, now one of the most powerful men in Westeros, delivered a eulogy that was remembered for generations. "My mother was the true queen of the Seven Kingdoms, though she never sat the throne," he said, his voice steady. "She shaped kings, commanded lords, and built a legacy that will outlive us all." Cersei, now queen consort to Stannis Baratheon, did not weep. She had been raised to believe that tears were weakness. But in the privacy of her chambers later that night, she allowed herself a single moment of grief. For all their differences, she had loved her mother. And now the world without Johanna Lannister seemed a little less certain. With Daenerys Targaryen married into the Baratheon bloodline, the threat of war had been averted. The Seven Kingdoms stood stronger than ever before, united not by conquest, but by careful alliances. Stannis ruled with the same discipline he always had, but his reign was far smoother with Cersei by his side. Though they were never a couple bound by love, they understood each other. Cersei learned to temper Stannis' harshness with political grace, while Stannis ensured that his wife's ambitions were never allowed to grow unchecked. Together, they ruled efficiently, and under their reign, Westeros entered an era of prosperity. But as history had shown time and time again, peace in Westeros never lasted forever, and the next great test of the realm was already on the horizon. While Westeros played its Game of Thrones, another danger had been growing in the north. The Night's Watch had sent ravens, warning of strange disappearances beyond the wall. Wildlings spoke of shadows that moved in the night, of creatures long thought to be myths. And when the first reports came of villages being wiped out without a trace, even the most skeptical lords could no longer ignore the truth. The long night was returning. Eddard Stark, now an elder statesman in the north, called for aid. And for the first time in history, the Lannisters answered. Jaime Lannister led an army of Westerland forces north, marching under the golden lion of his house. He was not the reckless young man who had once dreamed of nothing but battle. He was a leader now, a man who understood that this war was not for glory, but for survival. Beside him rode his brother Tyrion, who had convinced King Stannis that the realm's true enemy was not in Essos or within the noble houses, but beyond the wall. And leading the charge with them was Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, who had become something far greater than anyone had ever imagined. The armies of Westeros gathered at the wall, prepared to fight not for crowns or land, but for the very survival of mankind. When the White Walkers finally came, they were not met by a fractured realm or petty kings squabbling over thrones. They were met by the full force of the Seven Kingdoms, united under one banner. Dragons soared through the sky, breathing fire upon the undead hordes. Lannister soldiers, trained in the discipline of war, fought beside northern bannermen, their swords cutting through the darkness. Jaime Lannister, the once disgraced heir of Casterly Rock, fought not for honor, but for the survival of his family. Tyrion, ever the strategist, devised battle plans that turned the tide of war in their favor. And Jon Snow, the bastard who had become a legend, led the final charge against the Night King himself. The battle was long, many fell, but in the end, Westeros endured. The Night King was slain, his army shattered, and as the dawn broke over the frozen battlefield, the realm stood victorious. With the White Walkers defeated, the Seven Kingdoms entered a golden age. Jaime returned to Casterly Rock, where he ruled wisely for decades, his name spoken with respect rather than scorn. Tyrion remained in King's Landing, serving as hand to the king for many years before retiring to write his memoirs, a book that would become known as The Lion and the Realm. Cersei remained by Stannis' side until the end of his reign, ensuring that their children would inherit a realm that had been reforged through careful diplomacy rather than war. And far beyond Westeros, in the histories written by maesters and scribes, there was one name that stood above them all: Johanna Lannister, the woman who had saved House Lannister, the woman who had reshaped Westeros, the woman who had won the Game of Thrones without ever needing to sit upon it. And so, the story ends, not with fire and blood, but with a lioness who lived long enough to see her pride rule the world.